Okay, so the first question is Bob needs a new roof on his house. Randy is the president of Randy's Roofing, and he tells him he will complete the job for $7,000 and he will start on Tuesday. Bob is excited and he says it's a deal. What do they have here? Is it A, an express contract, B, an ostensible agency agreement, C, an implied contract, or D, a contract or deed? So remember, an implied contract is one that I haven't actually said. I'm just acting as if it exists, but they've said it here, right? They've said it. Contract for deed is another term for land contract. So a contract for deed wouldn't be right. It's going to actually be the express contract. So the reason why it's express is because Randy and Bob have said it. It's a verbal contract. And that's okay because it's just about a roof that they're putting on. That'd probably be all right for a roof. But remember, we can't have verbal contracts in real estate unless they're short leases, right? And there is a law that says that in order for a real estate contract to be enforceable and that real estate contracts have to be in writing to be valid, there's a law that tells us that that's the case. Does anybody remember the law that says that real estate contracts have to be in writing? I know short leases don't count, but for the most part, real estate contracts have to be in writing. And remember that contract law, that's a law called the statute of frauds. And the statute of frauds reminds us that in terms of a real estate contract, we have to have the contract in writing in order for it to be enforceable. All right. So the next question is Lonnie is selling his investment property to Jen. The property is set to close on April 10th. However, Lonnie collected the rent for the month of April from his tenant at the beginning of the month. Okay, so Lonnie is selling his investment property to Jen. The property is set to close on April 10th. However, Lonnie collected the rent for the month of April from his tenant at the beginning of the month. So what's going to happen here? Jen will receive a credit from Lonnie for the rent from the period from the time of closing until the end of the month. The rent for April will be returned to the tenant and neither Lonnie or Jen will get it. Jen will owe Lonnie a credit for the portion of the month she owns the property, or Lonnie will typically keep all of the rent for the month in which the property is sold. Remember our debits and credits, right? If we're at a closing and we're getting money, it's a credit. And if we're at a closing and we're paying money, it's a debit. And I always remember this, like, if I take out my debit card to pay for something, I swipe my debit card, I'm paying for it. But if I have a credit coming to me, I remember that, like, what if I bought a sweater at the mall and I lost the receipt, but I go back and I take the sweater back to the mall. They're going to give me store credit in order to buy something else. I don't have the receipt. They're not going to give me cash, but they're going to give me store credit. So I'm going to get credit to buy something else or spend the money on something else. And that's how the closings work. When we get a debit, we're giving money. When we get a credit, we're receiving money, right? So Jen will receive a credit from Lonnie for the rent from the period of time from closing until the end of the month. And the reason why is because Lonnie collected that rent in advance. If I collect rent, I usually collect it in advance. My landlord doesn't want the rent for the month at the end of the month. He wants it at the beginning of the month, right? And so since Jen's going to take over as the new landlord on April 10th and the tenant has already paid for the month of April, he's not going to pay again just because there's a new owner. Ronnie will have to Lonnie. I keep calling Ronnie. Lonnie will have to pass that money along to Jen in the form of a credit at the closing. Okay. All right. So next we have a legal document signed by a home buyer to assume responsibility for the obligations of a mortgage made by a former owner is it a deed, an option agreement, an appraisal, or an assumption agreement? What do you guys think? A deed, an option agreement, an appraisal, or an assumption agreement? This is the assumption agreement, right? Because they're assuming the loan. Okay. This person is taking over the loan. They're assuming the loan. What does it mean to assume a loan? If I'm assuming a loan, I am taking over the payments on this loan where the old holder of the note left off. So if I assume your loan, let's say that you have a loan that's a 20-year loan and you're 10 years into paying it, and I start to take over where you left off on this loan, then I would sign an assumption agreement that shows what I'm responsible for and that I'm now taking over where you left off. If I don't sign an assumption agreement that the bank approves of, then it's possible that the prior person who had the loan originally would still be on the hook for it. So hopefully we get an assumption agreement where the lender allows for that assumption to happen, right? Now, what if I just buy a property? So here's a question for you guys. What if I just buy a property and I don't actually assume the loan? I leave the loan in your name. I know there's a lien on the property. I know there's a loan owed still on the property, but I leave that loan in your name, but you give me the deed. That's a tough one. What do you guys think that's called? If I buy a property and I know there's an existing loan on it, I'm not actually assuming the loan, but I'm kind of just taking over. I've got the deed to the property now. What do we call that? I'm buying the property subject to the existing mortgage. So that's different than an assumption, because in an assumption, I'm taking responsibility for the loan. I'm going to take over the payments. I'm saying that this is my loan now. But on subject to, I'm leaving the loan over here in your name and I'm buying it and moving forward. I got the deed, I have control, but the loan stays in your name. Now I might mail in the payments or whatever the agreement may be, but the loan remains the primary responsibility of the person who already took it out. So Fred is buying a house on land contract, which means he will pay the seller directly for the home and receive the deed at a later date when the terms of the contract have been met. What is Fred called? He's the buyer on a land contract. Anybody remember what the buyer on a land contract is called? Is it the optionor, the mortgagee, the vendor, or the vendee? What is the buyer on the land contract called? I'll give everybody a second to think about this one. See if you guys know this one. The vendee. Chat. The vendee is the buyer in the land contract. The vendor is the seller in the land contract. Okay. So here, Fred is called the vendee. So the seller in the land contract is called the vendor. The buyer is called the vendee. Okay, next question. Bobby Sue just accepted and signed an offer from Irene. She handed it to her broker and asked him to deliver it to Irene. When the broker arrives at Irene's home, she learns from Irene's nurse that Irene suffers from advanced dementia and has no idea that she made the offer. Do they have a contract? Do Bobby Sue and Irene have a contract? What do you guys think? Remember what we have to have a contract. We have to have 4 things. We have to have consideration. We have to have a meeting of the minds. We have to have competent parties, and we have to have legal purpose. Now, if Irene has advanced dementia, is she a competent party to enter into this contract with us? No, right? She can't do it because she's not a competent party. She could do it, but the contract would not be valid. So no, Irene was not competent to enter into the contract due to her advanced dementia. So the answer here is no, because she has the advanced dementia. She is not competent to enter into the contract. So therefore, we don't have a valid contract. So let's go through those elements of a valid contract one time real quickly. We have to have consideration. Remember, consideration is my promise to you and your promise back to me. In the terms of a real estate contract, for example, I would tell you, oh, I'm going to give you $300,000. In exchange for my $300,000, you're going to give me a property. You're going to give me a house. That's consideration. We swapped a promise there. I'm giving you money. You give me a house. The second element that we have to have a valid contract is we have to have a meeting of the minds. So what happens when our minds meet? One of us says something that we're going to be willing to do. The other one says something they're going to be willing to do. And when we come to a complete agreement, now our minds have met. Now, what if we're still negotiating? What if I say to you, I really want you to leave me the refrigerator in the house, right? We're negotiating the sale of this house. And I say, I'll buy the house, but I want you to leave my refrigerator. And you're like, no, I'm not going to leave my refrigerator. Well, in that case, our minds haven't met, have they? Because we're still arguing over whether or not the refrigerator is going to stay or go. So that is where we would be lacking on meeting of the minds there. Once our minds come together and we agree on everything, we can have the second element of that valid contract. The third element of the valid contract, competent parties, we just talked about. And the fourth one, legal purpose. I have to be able to complete the contract as it's written within the confines of the law. And if I can't, then we can't have a valid contract, right? So for example, if I want to open a petting zoo and I want to buy your farm and open up a petting zoo, and I write a contract, I'm buying your property at 123 Main Street for the purposes of opening a petting zoo. But come to find out, I can't open a petting zoo because it's not zoned for having a petting zoo. It's only zoned for the agricultural farming part of things, not for the commercial petting zoo. then we don't have any way to legally complete that contract the way it's written. Therefore, we can't have a valid contract, right? All right. So the next question, a broker is holding earnest money without depositing it. This is what? This is a little bit of a tricky question. So remember, we got to read through the whole question and the answers. A broker is holding earnest money without depositing it. This is A, legal if the parties have a verbal contract to hold the earnest money without depositing it. B, legal if the parties agree to it in writing. C, always unethical. Or D, never legal. What do you guys think? Which one is it? Is it legal, illegal, unethical, sometimes legal, maybe legal? All right. So remember the rule of thumb with earnest money. Whatever the two parties agree to in writing is what we do. And so it's legal if the parties agree to it in writing. If it says in the contract and the two parties agree to it that they want the broker to hold on to the earnest money without depositing it, as long as they agree in writing in the contract, that's okay. Normally, though, remember we have certain time periods that when we get an earnest money check that we have to get it into our trust account. But in this case, we're being given separate instructions, different instructions in the contract itself that the two parties have signed off on. All right. Fred makes an offer and he states that time is of the essence. Fred asks that the seller respond within 5 days. The seller is the kind of guy who really likes to think things over. On the 6th day, the seller calls Fred to say he accepts his offer. Is Fred still obligated to move forward? Okay. So is it no, the offer expired before the seller accepted and Fred is no longer obligated to move forward? Is it yes, there is a 1-day grace period on real estate offer acceptance? Is it yes, the offer was accepted by the seller? Or is it no, Fred did not supply sufficient earnest money to bind the contract? So in this case, it is no, because Fred is off the hook here. Why is he off the hook? Because his offer expired. He gave a deadline, a time frame for this person to respond to his offer. The offer expired. He didn't accept it within that time frame. Therefore, the person who made the offer is free to move on. He's not to be bound by this. But let's say that later on the seller says that he wants to do this and the time is expired, but Fred still wants to do it. He could choose to go ahead and accept it and make it a contract. He could choose to say, that's okay. I don't care that it's expired. My offer is still good, but he doesn't have to. And that's the difference. He doesn't have to move forward with it. All right. A defeasance clause states that what? What does a defeasance clause state? That if the borrower transfers the deed to a new owner prior to paying off his debt, the lender will accelerate the loan. That's a term that we need to know for our exam, but that is not a defeasance clause, right? B is that the seller will defend the title if an issue arises. C, that if the loan is paid off early, the seller will charge the borrower a fee. That's a prepayment penalty clause, right? Or D, that when the loan debt has been fully paid, the lender must release the property from the lien so that legal title is free from the lien will be owned by the borrower. And so defeasance, what does that sound like? What does the word defeasance sound like? It sounds like defeat, right? So if I defeat my lender, he has to let me go. A defeasance clause, we're doing a lien on the property. Once I pay off the loan, they have to remove the lien. If it's a deed of trust where a trustee is holding on to the deed while I'm making my payments, if there's a defeasance clause that says, hey, once I've got that loan paid off, then I got to get my deed of reconveyance. They've got to give the deed back to me, right? So the defeasance clause just says, hey, I've got my lender defeated. He needs to go away and leave me alone now, basically. So the correct answer is that when the loan debt has been fully paid, the lender must release the property from the lien so that the legal title free from the lien will be owned by the borrower. All right. So next we have Broker Jan. Broker Jan's listing has received multiple offers. She would like to tell the people making the offers that they are in a multiple offer situation. What will she need in order to be able to share this information? Is it A, written permission of the real estate commissioner, B, a multiple listing agreement, C, a court order, or D, written permission of her seller? Remember what we have to do in order to share confidential information about our client or our client's property. It's confidential information that Broker Dan has gotten these multiple offers. She can't just go ahead and tell everybody that. She has to get written permission of her seller in order to share that information. Now, I've had people say to me, I've heard agents say, well, why the heck would my seller not want everybody to know we're in multiple offers? Won't it start a bidding war and everybody will just be going out and paying all kinds of money for the house. And wouldn't that be wonderful? And maybe, maybe not. So I can tell you that me personally, I used to buy a lot of investment properties. And I will tell you that when I would go to make an offer on an investment property, many times if I knew there was a ton of offers, I would just pull my offer. I don't want to get involved in that kind of thing anymore. I knew what I was willing to pay for the property, and that kind of thing isn't my thing. So some people will be competitive and they will say, oh, let me just keep raising my offer, or let me really jump in there whole hog. And other people maybe like me, who are like, I'm not a competitive gal. I just want to pull out of this whole mess. Let me out of here, right? It could go that way too. So just because we think, oh, well, on the surface, it sounds like a good idea to let the world know that we're multiple offers, we really need to leave that decision up to our seller. And the seller has to let us know that it's okay to do that in writing before we go telling everybody about that. Okay. Peggy has always wanted to be a farmer. She has decided to sell her 10-acre property to Sam and move to a larger multi-acre property where she can grow her own crops and raise animals. So Sam, knowing about Peggy's dream, offers her 10 cows, a llama, and a tractor in exchange for the purchase of her current 10-acre property. What do we call this? Do we call this boot? Do we call this good consideration? Do we call this valuable consideration? Or do we call this equity? I'll give you guys a chance to think about this one. If anybody knows, hit me up in the chat. Let me know if any of you guys know what this one would be. Would this be boot, good consideration, valuable consideration, or equity? So this is valuable consideration. Remember, valuable consideration doesn't have to be money. It could be a cow. It could be a llama. It could be a tractor. Now, these are not things that I'm out looking for. Like, I don't have any place to put 10 cows, a llama, and a tractor. I live in a subdivision, right? But for some people, this may be a great even exchange. Sam was willing to give these things. They exchange things that are valuable to them. So this is valuable consideration. Now, we see another word on here that's a little bit confusing, and people always ask about this. What about good consideration? What is the difference between good and valuable consideration? So valuable consideration is when it's something of value for something else. Good consideration is a gift. Okay. So if my grandma loves me, which she does, if my grandma loves me and she gives me real estate as a gift, in exchange for that, my consideration to give back to her in return would be my love and affection, right? Or if you were my daughter and I gave you a house as a gift, then in exchange from that, I get from you good consideration, which is love and affection. So good consideration is just my love and affection in exchange for something of value for you. It's a gift. It's a way of describing a gift. All right. Well, let's talk about one more word on here before we move on, because there's another interesting word on here that we don't always hear a lot, but we need to know, and it's boot. So if you guys have heard of a 1031 exchange, that's when I'm taking a property and I'm selling it, and I'm very quickly reinvesting that money that I made from the sale of that existing building in some like-kind property, like-kind exchange, right? 1031 like-kind exchange. So I'm taking the money that I make from the sale of one property, I'm reinvesting it in short order in another like similar property. And therefore, I'm delaying the capital gains tax that I would have paid on the profit from that sale off to another day. That's what 1031 exchange is about. But sometimes I don't reinvest the entire amount of money that I got from the sale. If I take some of that money that I got from the sale and instead of reinvesting it, I stick it in my pocket, I would have to pay capital gains on that part that I kept out right away rather than later, even in a 1031 exchange. And we call that money that didn't get reinvested, we call it boot. So if you're wondering what boot is, that's what boot is. All right, next question. When one party to a contract withdraws and a new party is substituted, with the consent of all parties, releasing the withdrawing party of liability, it is known as, is it assumption, novation, disintermediation, or assignment? What do you guys think? Assumption, novation, disintermediation, or assignment? If you know this one, put it in the chat. Let us know what you think. We're substituting a new party for an old, and we're releasing the old. Old for new, that's novation, right? Old for new is ovation. I'm taking out the old and I'm replacing it with the new. It could be that I'm swapping one contract and out for a new contract because the old one wasn't working. Or it could be that I'm switching one party in a contract for another party in a contract. When I'm taking the old and replacing with something new, that's novation. Okay. Now, how is that different than assignment? In assignment, we're not doing something new. We're just taking it and handing it off elsewhere. So, in other words, if you were to make a contract to buy my house for $300,000 from me, and then you realize that you didn't have the money to close, but you wanted to make sure that somebody else closed in your place, you could assign the contract to your cousin Betty, and then Betty would be buying my house. Now, remember that unless I release you, just because you assign that contract to Betty doesn't mean you're off the hook. Betty has your rights, but not necessarily your obligations, right? You're still on the hook to me. I'm like, hey, you do what you want, but at the end of the day, you're the one who was in the contract with me. I want my money, make sure I get it, right? So that's assumption. So, like, next we have Gene is training a new agent in his office, Fred. Gene explains to Fred that the consideration given by the buyer in a real estate contract is a promise to do what? Is it offer liquidated damages? Is it remove all contingency in the contract within 2 weeks of acceptance? Is it offer earnest money? Or is it buy the property? So which one of these is the consideration? And the consideration is to buy the property, right? His promise is to buy the property. That's the promise he's making to the other party. That's the consideration. All right. Next we have Harry and Joe have a contract that states that if any term of the contract is held to be ineffective or invalid, the remaining contract term should nevertheless be given full force and effect. What do we call this contract term? Is it a survivorship clause? Is it a severability clause? Is it a broker protection clause? Or is it an escape clause? I'll give you guys a second to think about this. Survivorship clause, severability clause, broker protection clause, or escape clause. All right. This is the severability clause. Basically, I'm saying I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, is the old saying, right? If a part of the contract, if there's a severability clause in the contract, it says that if a part of the contract is no longer good for us, then I can chop off part of it, right? Without having to throw the whole thing away, and the rest of the contract can stay. So, for example, let's say that there's a part of the contract we need to change something about the closing date or the terms. We can go back and renegotiate that without having to start from scratch on the contract if there's a severability clause in it. Okay. Greg is a bargain hunter. During a listing presentation, he tells the salesperson he will only list with her brokerage if he can get a lower commission than she has proposed. So this is a salesperson. She's working for a broker. She's out doing this listing presentation, and Greg decides to strong arm her into doing the commission for less. What can she do here? What should she say? Is it A, yes, that will work for me? B, no, the local realtor association says we must always charge a 6% commission. C, no, state law says that she cannot lower the commission. Or D, I will need to check with my broker to see if it is approved by him. What do you guys think? Who should she check with? So she would say, I will need to check with my broker and see if it's approved by him. Why would she need to check with her broker to see if it's approved by him? Because maybe the office standards that the broker has set for the office, he says, hey, listen, I want everybody to try to get their commission to come in at a certain point, right? Everybody have their commission come in and have it at a certain point. And so for our office, I'm allowed to go in as the broker of the office and to tell the agents what I want the commission for our office to be. This is what I want you to strive for. This is what I want you to agree to. Now, that's different than price fixing. I can't get together with competing brokers and say, hey, guys, let's all get together and everybody, all us competing brokers, we're going to say that the minimum commission we're each going to charge is 6%. No, we're not allowed to do that. That's an antitrust violation. That's price fixing when we're getting together to try to fix the prices with the competition. However, I am allowed to say within my own office, here's the standard. So she might have to go back and make sure if it's below what she's been told to try to get the commission set at, that it's okay with her broker before she agrees to that listing.